Well, previously I asked you to think about streets as one of those layers that build up in the city, but actually streets, we also have to think about them as a network, or a grid if you like. Think of New York. That's probably what you think of when I say grid, but London, Sacramento, they're all grids. Different types of grids, but they're all about the same scale, and that grid has a big impact on how the city feels. So if we look at this plan here of a town I've largely made up, let's assume this is a market town. So you've got the market square here, and we've got lots of roads connecting, and the most connected space is the main road or the market square here, so that's where we get the main commercial uses. And we find the sort of medieval part of the town here, where we've got all the roads interconnecting at about every 80 to 100 metres. It's really accessible to get about. We've got a big site here, we might have a factory or a livestock market, and this has a very distinct character. And here we've got a Georgian addition with a park and a circus and some cul-de-sacs, or mews as the Georgian like to call them. And that's all planned, that's all very regular. That has a very different feel. And you'll go there and you'll think, well, these are nice Georgian buildings, or you might not if you don't like them. And the reason they have that feel is because they've got that structure and not that. And then if we take this away, we see something horrific which was delivered in the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s, some sort of housing estate, urban extension. And we see lots of big curvy roads, lots of cul-de-sacs. There's multiple different examples of this, and that creates a very different character to this or this. And people will go there and probably blame the 1960s houses and saying this doesn't feel very nice, it feels like a housing estate. But actually it's not those houses, it's because you've got that and not that. So it's that problem at this level of a layer and how that grid works that really matters about how we feel in the different part of the city, but how we move around in the city. And if you think you live here, it's a bit of a pain to get here compared to here, because you've got to go one route and it's a long way round. It really impacts how you move around a place. You know, if you live here and want to get here, you've got to go all the way round. Whereas if it was a connected route, it would be easy to get from one to the other. So this is really common of this sort of era, and there's worse examples, there's better examples, and I want to take you to one which is probably a bit of a Marmite development for that era, and that is the Barbican. Now I think the Barbican is actually a really good example of the architecture of its era, but a terrible example of a movement network. To explain that, I've got a plan here which shows what was there before the Barbican, before the Germans blitzed it essentially, and before the planners of the 50s and 60s demolished the rest. And if we see the two axes, if I wanted to get from one to the other, it was fairly easy. I went along the streets and got there. Well, let's go there and see how we get there now. Right, we're here at the Barbican now. This road used to go basically to the front of where the art centre is before this was built. So let's see what it's like to get to the art centre. Well, there's the art centre I want to get to, that the street would have taken us to before this was built. I can't get to it because there's a great big lake there. I mean, the lake acts a bit like a moat on a castle. It'd be far easier if there was, grass there and I could just walk across a bit of open space. It'd be more useful in the city. Instead, I've got to go over this walkway up here and up some steps to get to it, so let's head that way. Well, in a medieval castle, a spiral staircase is designed so it's easy to attack people when people are coming up the stairs. This is designed exactly the same way. Really not what you want in a city. Well, I can see the arts centre down there, still can't get to it. Well, we've arrived. A bit of open space there to walk across would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? Moving back from the Barbican to the smaller town, the market town, or the smaller city context, or even the outer London context, you find that there'll be a whole series of urban extensions, probably akin to this, that have been delivered over the last 70 odd years, tagged onto the side of the town. Every time there's a need for more housing, there'll be a battle, and then the next farm or the next field will get released. That's delivered in isolation. You get something like this, where we have a market town and we have a whole series of essentially housing estates around it that don't integrate with each other. In the core, we've got something like this, which all connects, and then we've got all these separate areas that just don't connect very well. And that gives it a very distinct character. So it's no wonder people object to another housing estate appearing, because they all feel a bit the same and they don't work particularly well. Whereas if we'd planned for that and we hadn't delivered this, we'd said, right, we are going to have 60 years of growth and we're going to plan for a grid like this. We're not going to plan for a field and then a gap and then another development that comes forward. We would create something which works far better. So if we take this second example, we've got the same town, and I've assumed that we've planned for that. 60 years ago, we've assumed that people actually understood this thing around how streets work and how they create character, which they largely didn't, as we do now, and they'd planned for it. And you can see the character of the city in the centre is fairly similar to further out, so it doesn't really matter whether we'd had modern buildings or those 60s semis or whatever in the newer part of the town. If we had that old structure, it would have more of that character that people tend to like where they see historic buildings, and they attribute that character to those buildings, but actually it's that structure, not that structure, rather than the buildings that create that. So please think of the layer, think of streets, and think about streets when you walk along them as a network.